Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank, excuse me, all the speakers who gave a bunch of very interesting talks, and I think we've all learned a lot from it and really appreciate their contribution. I also want to thank all of you who attended, who've come here as we've been able to resume the CDAR Symposium after a 2.5-year hiatus. We're delighted at the turnout and hope that in future it will be even larger. I want to thank Sang for all of the work she did on the logistics. Sang basically puts this whole event together, and really appreciate your efforts in that, so thank you. I want to talk a little bit about resilience because it was the explicit topic of the first talk, and in a sense it was also the topic of the last talk. As Lisa mentioned, 2.5 years ago when we had the last symposium, we had to move it down off campus because there was no power on campus. And the reason there was no power was that the transmission lines went through an area where there was high fire risk. So that, global warming has had permanent changes on the environment here in California. And this week, Stanford has essentially the same problem. There's no or very little power on campus because although they have 100% green energy coming from, I believe, mostly from wind, the wind farm is somewhere in the East Bay, and the transmission lines go through an area which is shut down because of fire concerns. Of course, in addition to that, we've had the pandemic, which was its own, demonstration of resilience failure. I want to mention another consequence of resilience failure, which is inflation. So up until relatively recently, it was argued that the sole source of the inflation we're seeing was, in fact, supply chain disruption. And I think now the consensus on that has shifted to say that that may have been the source, but that also the stimulation that was done in order to keep the economy moving may have contributed substantially. Some people may believe that's the primary source. Whatever the truth of that in terms of the cause, the Federal Reserve is now embarking on a deliberate policy of restricting demand by increasing interest rates. And so that means that whether or not fiscal and monetary policy was the source of the inflation, monetary policy is going to work to slow down the economy in an attempt to reduce the inflation. So this is another potentially long-term consequence, which at least in part and maybe to a large extent came from the pandemic. Some of you know that I just recovered from my first case of COVID, and it was pretty typical for what people are experiencing now. It was relatively easy, but that was due to, in my case, 4 vaccinations and from the low morbidity of the variants that are currently circulating, and also due to the availability of Paxlovid. And I think right now we're feeling fairly comfortable with the situation going forward. But I want to emphasize there's no guarantee that future evolution of the virus will be in the direction of lower morbidity. There's a general tendency for viruses to become less severe over time, and maybe we'll be lucky and that will happen, but we can't guarantee that. Second thing is that the death toll in the US currently is still about 300 deaths per day, which is 100,000 a year. And to put that in perspective, that's about 3 times the annual death toll from seasonal flu. So this is still, even at the present setting, is still a big event in comparison to the effect of respiratory diseases we've seen in the, in normal years before this all happened. And final thing in terms of concern is long COVID. So long COVID seems to happen to a substantial fraction of people. It seems not to depend a whole lot on how severe the initial disease was. We don't yet know whether multiple exposures to COVID, multiple sicknesses, increase the risk of long COVID. But that's a potential concern if we get into a setting where most people get COVID once or twice a year. Does that mean that a large fraction of people develop long COVID or not? We don't really know. And I think it's important that we do the mitigation measures that are easy to do. We may not do the extreme things that we have done in the last 2.5 years, but at the same time, we shouldn't give up on things that help to reduce the effect of the disease when they're relatively easy to do so. One thing to keep in mind in this is that the mutation rate is at least roughly proportional to the number of new infections. It's proportional to the number of people who are currently carrying the virus and giving it an environment in which it can mutate. So the more people who have it, the faster it mutates. And a strategy to try to reduce in ways that are less costly the number of people who are getting it would provide some protection against the possibility of either mutations that are more dangerous or increases in long COVID. One thing I find particularly striking is the situation in China. So I think putting aside the initial month or 6 weeks, China's been extremely successful in containing this, and they showed that a very intensive effort to eliminate all cases, could in effect keep a very large country essentially free from it at moderate cost for 2.5 years, whereas other countries have expended a lot more resources and been much less successful at doing that. But that strategy seems to be at the end of its feasibility because the current variants are 5 to 10 times more contagious than the initial ones. And the cost of containing it and getting to zero is extremely high. We've seen all of Shanghai closed down for about 6 weeks, and we're seeing partial close downs happening in other cities. And China is under-vaccinated, especially in the older population. So this seems to be, to me, to be a striking failure. Apparently only about 50% of the elderly are vaccinated. And this is very surprising given that China has the ability to implement coercive measures in a way that governments in the West typically don't, and in fact is doing so in terms of mandatory testing and quarantine. So given the ability and the willingness to use those, the unwillingness or inattention that means it hasn't been applied to vaccination seems to me to be terribly misguided. When I've talked to a number of people in China about this, and I won't quote anyone, but what I've heard back is that people think it's connected to the October Central Committee meeting of the Communist Party, and once that's over, then they will start to move towards greater vaccination and lightening up the controls. And I hope that's correct, but I still don't see a reason, now not to pursue very hard a vaccination campaign so that when the time comes to open up, that can be done more easily, and that the costs in terms of lives lost and morbidity will be reduced. So I think that there's a lot that is not being done that should be done for mitigation of COVID. We should do the cheap things, make sure they get done, and that's not happening in the way it ideally should. Much the same is true in cyber risk, as we heard in the last talk. But this is something that will be with us. I think to large degree, these issues represent a political failure, and different countries have had different policies and different successes and failures. But I think that the countries that have had the stronger and more resilient political systems have been more resilient in dealing with these kinds of problems. So with that, I want to again thank you for coming and please feel free to stay around for, we'll be here till 6, and we look forward to seeing you probably next February for the next CDAR Symposium. So thank you.